What's up, everyone? Jacob Roach back here from the Killing Joke Studios and Mixing with Mel. Today, I have another mix critique for you. This one comes courtesy of James Buffalin, I believe is how you pronounce the last name. James, if I screwed that up, I'm super sorry. I promise you I didn't mean to. So James sent me this melodic hardcore song and asked if I could critique it. As always, if you want your stuff mixed or if you want to do a critique like this, just use the form in the description below or send me an email at the email address in the description, and we can always work that out. But this one comes from James. It is just an instrumental song, and before we dive into what I did with it, I'm just going to get his process stems out and let you listen to the mix that James came up with. So I have some bussing going on here. So let me just get all of that stuff out of here to just show you what exactly James was working with. These go out. These go out. And I believe that's it. So yeah, this is what I was sent. Let me disable all these plugins and he sends. All right, here we go. So this is the track that James sent me. I guess I should equal out all these volumes as well. So let me let you listen to another part of the song, just get a better feel for it. All right, so everything sounds good. Let me just go some broad overview really quick here of how the mix sounds in general. So overall, I actually think it's pretty good. The everything frequency wise seems to fit pretty well. It's a little bright for my taste, but I don't think that there's anything particularly offensive in there. I don't think it's like, hey, this is too bass heavy, this is too bright, anything like that. So overall, good job, James. You really kind of got your EQing down pretty good. I would say the drums in particular lack some impact, and I think that might be due to the compression you're using. That might be due to the samples you're using. I'm not 100% sure. I'll dive into that once I get to how I process the drums. But just as an overall view of the drums, I think that maybe experimenting with different samples and trying some different compression settings can really help you. Also, I don't know if the reverb was baked into the samples. It sounds like they might have been. If they were, try and use dry samples and then add your own reverb. And if they weren't and you add your own reverb, cut back on it a little bit. Next, moving down to the guitars. I would say the guitars are pretty good. They're a little heavy on the gain for my taste. So I mentioned this in the last critique, and actually a lot of songs I'm sent to mix, I always ask for a DI because this is something that happens quite frequently where just the guitars have way too much gain in them. In a song like this in particular, it's the majority of it's just these big, power chords and, just strumming along. And you really, really need to cut back on the gain to get any clarity out of that. I mean, I would say even less gain than like that tight, chuggy, whatever stuff, because here you're really hitting that guitar and really hitting the front end of that amp, whether it's virtual or not. And so you need to cut back quite a bit. So here, let me just show you the guitars in isolation. So yeah, lots and lots of gain there. Cut back on that. EQ-wise on the guitars, I think they're lacking a little bit of beef. I think you could... It sounds like they're lacking at both areas of the frequency spectrum. I know a lot of people high pass and low pass their guitars. I will typically do a high pass just a little bit, not too much, and I almost never low pass, just because really when you're talking about above 12K or something like that, 10K, 12K, the people that when you're low passing up there, you're really just removing harmonic content, and you can hear it. You can for sure hear it just because a guitar, especially a distorted guitar, is so dense in harmonics and frequency. But I don't think you're really doing much to influence the sound besides making the guitar sound dull. So I think that harmonic content up there, if the guitars sound too harsh, then I would go back to the amp. I wouldn't add an EQ and just cut those frequencies out, because I think those frequencies are actually really important harmonically when distorting a guitar. Moving on to the bass is actually excellent. So James actually told me that for the bass, he was looking for he was trying to distort it and it wasn't really working out, so he just went with like a straightforward tone. Let me just play that in isolation for you. And it sounds like it could be. It sounds either it's extremely well recorded or it's programmed. And either way, kudos to you, James. You did get an excellent bass tone, and if you did program it, then it is a very, very realistic, very, very realistic instrument, and that's a good thing. You want to get. I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to programming bass. In fact, in a lot of cases, I think it's actually a better option for metal. But if you're going to program bass, make sure you're using a realistic instrument, just because it can just it's one of those things that you don't really think about, because the low end often sits below the rest of the mix, and the bass is kind of tucked away and you may not be hearing the actual pick attack and all that stuff. But it's just, after listening to enough records that have programmed bass, especially when they're bad, when it's a fake sounding instrument, you can just tell immediately, and it really, really compromises the integrity of the song as a whole. Other than that, this lead guitar, it is what it is. In the context of the song, I think it actually works really well. I think that maybe using a different delay. I think you got the gain here good. I think you got the setting on the amp good. The guitar tone sounds fine. The delay I like, but I think you can even wash it out more. It's a nitpick though. Overall, there's no problems there. And then the clean guitars, I literally did not touch at all. I think they're just fine. Yeah, I think they're good. I don't see any problem with that. I like the reverb, let's see. Sounds like there might be a delay in there. If it is a delay, then it's washed out through reverb. But I like the settings that you have on that, so I think overall, good job there. I didn't let you guys listen to the drums, so let's go back to here, because I feel like this is going to be the biggest area of improvement. And so let me just listen to this and give you a few more critiques about the specifics of the drums. So a couple things here. Number one, the cymbals. I will show you on the Spectrum Analyzer what is happening with the cymbals, and I think this is a thing that is not the best for most recordings. I guess I have to take this out of bypass, and then I'll just disable this really quick. So I actually have this EQ point here to remind me to talk about this. So it looks like it's like high passed about 500 hertz. A lot of people do this. I'm not a fan of it, just because I feel like a lot more can come from the overheads. Now, these are obviously programmed. It's making the cymbals sound thin. So in an ideal, a cymbal as a whole obviously focuses on the top end of the frequency spectrum, but I do think there's something to be said about, kind of that mid-range in a lot of cymbals, just because when you're hitting a cymbal, there's a lot of different frequencies happening, not even taking into account what's going on in the room, what's reflecting, all of that stuff. And I think for a natural drum sound, that area is really important. And once I dive into how I process them, you're going to see that I had to do some things to make this drum kit sound cohesive. Now, right now, the only thing tying the drum kit together is the reverb that is on the close mics. I'm not a fan of it. Again, I think it lacks the impact, and I think it lacks the punch of drums that I like listening to. The drums right now, they sound stock to me. And that's not bad, and a lot of people go with that sound, especially if they're, if those are the samples they have access to, or if that's the instrument they have access to, that's what they go with. However, there are a lot of very inexpensive samples that will get you a better result with a little bit of knowledge on how to EQ and compress and add your own, virtual space to the drums. And I think that's where you're missing out the most, is that these sound like baked in samples where you threw them on and called it a day. And because of that, they don't sound like anything special. If I'm wrong on that, then hopefully when I go through how I process them, that will help you out. So I've been talking a storm about how much, what I did on the processing. So let's switch back over to that. So these go out. This goes out. These come back in. It's going to take a minute to load all those. All right. These come back in. And then all of my routing comes back in. I think that, and then the guitars, of course, come back in. All right. There we go. Perfect. All right. So I have to remember exactly how I had this set up. I think I was a little bit higher on this, a little bit lower on this, and I think I cut this down a little bit. I'll adjust it a little bit on the fly as we go through because I don't remember exactly where I had the volume set. So anyway, if you're listening on headphones, make sure you are listening on anything really. Make sure you turn down your volume really quick because my mix is a bit louder. But I'm just going to play it through real quick for you so you can hear what it sounds like. All right, so let's start at the top with the drums. So the cymbals, really, these were already processed. So James didn't, I need to cut this back out. Forgot to turn that back on. James didn't have all of the unprocessed stems. So the cymbals, the bass, and then the lead and clean guitars, which I didn't really touch at all. But so really just the bass and the cymbals were already processed, and I tried to do what I could to make, to try and fix it in the mix or put it all together in the mix. And so the cymbals here, there's not a lot going on. So basically all I have is a high-end cut here. They were a little too brittle for my taste. I like cymbals that are slightly darker. And then I added an exciter, a widener. The cymbals just didn't have that space, and this is what I came out with. So I didn't really know exactly how to tackle these just because they were already processed, and there was a lot of information lost with that super, super high pass. So basically before and after, here's how it sounds. So just sitting the cymbals back in the stereo space a little bit and having them open up a little bit wider so that there's not as much, it's not as harsh. I didn't really care for the sound before. It wasn't bad. I don't think they were particularly, offensive or anything. They sounded a little bit washed out because of how much top end was there. So next, moving on to the kick. Now, on the kick in the snare, I changed the samples. I didn't change the samples on the toms just because loading up like a trigger sample, the overlap from the delay was triggering triggering the samples multiple times, and it was getting to be kind of a mess. And so I'll still walk you through how I would normally process them, but those are the stock samples you sent me. But anyway, still back up here to the kick. Here's what James sent. And then I added a sample in there. These samples are from Taylor Larson. I don't know if he has a store for the samples or not. If he does, I'll look it up after I record this video. If he does, I'll put it in the link to the description. They're pretty expensive, but they sound great. If you want an alternative and you want some just solid dry samples that will get you pretty far as mixing and blending with other samples, you can check out my sample pack. It's only like $15, so just grabbing those, downloading them will help you get some consistency and cut that bleed and all that fun stuff. So after the sample. All right, and I should really mute this drum room. It's going to be a little confusing, so super dry, nothing else going on there. And I think it's really important to get that dry, impactful hit initially, and then we'll add that space on top of it. Next, we have an EQ, and it looks like a spaghetti mess here. So I'll just bring that in to show you what it's doing. So typically I split this process among multiple EQs. I just did it all in Pro Q2 just because I can. You know, Pro Q2 just allows you to do that. And so I wanted to have you guys be able to visualize it all in one EQ. So essentially, here's my general thought process. I first off roll off any extreme sub region, and I use a pretty steep Q. So this is at 38 hertz, just because, man, in metal, you don't really need anything below that, and anything that is going to be below that, if someone's listening on subs, is probably going to not sound very good anyway. And so I just end up cutting it, and then I do a bump. So that's exactly what's happening here. Cut out some lows, and then bump at the cut to add that sub impact. Slightly above it, it's curving down, and then I'm cutting some of this nasty, what I would call above bass territory. It's not exactly into the mid-range yet. It's like the nasty 200 hertz region of a bass signal, whether it's kick or bass guitar, that is kind of flubby and gross and doesn't really lend itself to a tight low end. So I'm cutting a little bit of that out, using a pretty wide Q so that it's not too extreme. There was just something here in the sample that I didn't like around 400, and so I did a pretty tight cut there. Plus, it helps accentuate this. So this right here, and this is actually a Taylor Larson technique, was trying to find something in the mid-range that helps the kick punch through the mix. And so initially, when I first started recording, I'd, cut mids, boost low end, boost top end on the kick, and call it a day. And that's how it worked. And you end up with one of two results. The first result is the kick just doesn't fit with the rest of the stuff going on in the mix. It sticks out way too much. Or it's really, really hard for it to cut through at all, just because there's a lot going on the top, there's a lot going on the low, and the mid-range of the guitar is really cutting through. So really what this is just finding where the kick really, really seems to punch in relation to the rest of the track. So typically what I'll do is I will EQ the bass in isolation, and then to find this frequency, I will EQ it in the context of the rest of the track. And then I'll come back after I've gotten all my EQing done and check it again. Up here, this is a cut around the kind of harshness of a kick. So I'll show you the difference. It's one of those things that you don't really realize until you take the EQ out. Just that brittle top end of a kick drum, it's around like 4 to 5K. It doesn't sound great to my ears, at least. I think that above there you're fine, and a little bit below there you're fine, but right in that area it sounds particularly offensive. This sample is not really that bad, but a lot of kick drums sound really strange up there, and you'll have it sticking out of the mix, and you won't exactly know why. At least I did for quite a long time. I never understood why my kick drums were sticking out of the mix, so why they were so present, and why I couldn't get them to fit in the mix. And this region is a big, big part of that. Lastly, top end boost. Again, kind of making these boosts and then cuts and then boosts again will help you accentuate the areas of that you want to accentuate without, boosting this up 6 dB or whatever like that. You're essentially making the frequency range between the two even wider. And so this just adds a little bit of top end back into the kick. Again, harmonically. This is not stuff that you're, super actively listening to. Of course, you can hear it. If you couldn't hear it, then there'd be no point in actually doing it. So you can hear it, but this is mostly harmonic content. Just add a little bit more top end to the kick. So looks like a mess. Actually pretty easy though. General principles here are going to be cut out the lows, boost right there. Find an area in the mid-range where it cuts through the mix. Cut out some nasty top end if it's sounding too offensive or gross. And then carve as far as like this low-mid area. If there's anything that just sounds offensive, just carve that out of there. So looks like a lot, really not that complex. Next, got to hit it with compression. And this is, I think, going to be a big area where you can really, really start hearing the difference in the kick drum as far as these drums go and the drums you sent me. So I'm using the FG Stress here and really, really slamming this compressor. So let me just let you listen to it, and I'll talk to you about what I did. And this is another reason why I cut that top end right there, because if I didn't, going into that compressor, it would just accentuate it even more, and it would sound like it sounds like metal almost. Not metal, not metal, the music. It sounds like metal hitting your ears, and that's not what I'm really looking for. So this is just one variation of a way you can compress a kick drum. Of course, you don't need the FG Stress to do it. You can do it with any compressor. The principles are the same. So what you're looking for is to compress it quite a bit. I slam my close mics a lot into a compressor. And the reason that you can get away with that is because of the slow attack, fast release principle. So essentially what you're doing is you are telling the compressor that you want a slow attack, so you want that initial transient to come through, and then you want to clamp down really quickly and then let off. So you're essentially increasing the dynamic range of the signal. So that initial transient is coming through, it clamps down, and then it lets off slowly. And so between that split second initial transient and after, excuse me, you're effectively increasing the dynamic range, and because of that, increasing how punchy the signal sounds. So here, adding this in really, really does a lot, and I think that that's going to be an important part going forward. So don't need to use the FD Stress. The general principles are slow attack, fast release, and then drive the input. Don't be afraid to drive the input. You know, if it starts sounding bad, then dial it back. And if it just doesn't sound like it's slamming or if it's punching through, then increase that input. But as long as you have a slow attack and a fast release, you're generally pretty good. Experiment with the ratios, and here you can experiment with the different distortions. This stuff is all just extra on top of it. The core of it is the attack and the release. And as you can see, I have the release set to as fast as possible or slightly above. Attack, not completely slow. Again, you really just need to kind of tweak these to sound whenever it just sounds right. It'll just sit and be, the compressor just sounds like it's working. But I'm still staying at the slow range of attack and the fast range of release. So pretty simple there. Rounding it out, another EQ. Just after everything, I was like, okay, I want a little bit more. And this is a thing I'll do quite often where I will EQ before the compressor, and then I'll just do a little bit of cleanup after, just to see what the compressor's doing, and what frequencies it's accentuating, and then if there's anything here. So basically here, I found some stuff around 2.8 that I didn't like, cut it out, and then boosted around 80 hertz to add some sub bump. So let me bring that in. And so it's pretty subtle. You'll probably hear it more on the top end than the low end, but that's it. That's the kick drum. Pretty easy. Just use different samples. Try not to drown it in reverb, and you'll be good to go. Next is the snare. Same thing. New sample. So here was the snare that I was sent. Just lacks that impact. You can kind of tell that decay, whether it's a reverb or whether it's a room sample, just doesn't sound real. So add another sample to it. Again, this is a Larson sample. Just because typically when I do sampling like this, I will blend sometimes, but I will always use a set of samples. So I will use, for instance, if I was blending these with another set of samples, I would use both kicks and both snares from both of them to at least get that tonality in there, even if the blend between them is not exactly the same. So using the exact from the same set is something that's relatively important. I like to do it at least because it makes everything sound cohesive. So having that in there. Great. Sounds awesome. Next, got a UAD Neve EQ. Again, this is an expensive plugin. If you don't have a UAD system, don't feel like this is adding some sort of magic to my signal that you don't have access to. The principle is pretty similar, pretty easy here. Basically, what I'm doing is down here, cutting out some low end around 160 hertz, boosting just a little bit right above that to give the snare some body. Cutting a little bit around some harshness I found, it looks like 3.2, and then boosting some top end, and then driving the line a little bit to get some breakup. Partly I'm doing this for I write for the website. Sorry about that. I received a phone call. I just stop out for a minute. But what I was saying is, if you guys didn't know, I'm actually a writer for Sonic Scoop, and I'm demoing some Universal Audio plugins for some roundups we're doing and everything. And so this was just a good way to try this out. So don't feel obligated that this is the quintessential plugin that you'd have to use for this. So let me just bring this in and show you what it's doing. Adding some top end, boosting some lows. Next, same thing, just compressing. Same principles, slow attack, fast release. Again, the settings are a little bit different here. They're a little bit more tame on the snare, just because I think your ear's probably going to be more sensitive to a fake sounding snare than it's going to be to a fake sounding kick. So I'm more conservative with my settings on this compressor. All right, so you can see that not a whole lot of reduction is actually happening. Don't be confused. Generally with a snare, especially a live snare, I will do quite a bit. This sample is already pretty compressed, so I didn't need to do a lot with that. Again, same principles. The majority of this drum sound the majority of the compression settings are coming from the attack and release. The gain reduction is really just relative to what sounds good to your ear. So just focus on slow attack, fast release as a general principle. Moving on. So this is a copy of the snare. The exact same setting. Exact same thing I was sent. Difference is it has a room sample. Important, a stereo room sample in particular. Not a mono room sample. If you're going to use room samples on your drums, make sure they are stereo. In my mind, there is already plenty occupying the mono space in a recording, vocals, any lead guitars, any snare and kick and all that stuff. If you want to give your drum space, it should be stereo. So stereo room sample, pretty straightforward. Next, I have a preset here that I use for everything, boosting a bunch of top end on the sample and then compressing it. Same principle, slow attack, fast release. Pretty easy. Next, moving on to the rack tom. Rack tom and floor tom. I think I just copied the settings between the two. Yep, just because the samples were kind of problematic in general, so I just want to give a general overview. This is typically what I do. I find the low end frequency that sounds good on the top, cut a ton of mids, and then boost some top end. This is not even as extreme as I'll go sometimes, especially if their live toms are sound particularly bad. So that's with on there. This with it off. Tightening it up, having a punch through the mix. Same thing, compressor. This is just a different compressor. Slow attack, fast release. Helps that impact, and the same thing happens with this one. All right, so that is the drum sound overall. So what changes would I make? Well, number one, I would change these samples out. I would change all your samples out, have them be dry samples if possible, and mix from there, and then add any sort of space that you need after the fact. So that's number one. Number two, if you're programming, which these are certainly programmed, try to humanize as much as possible. For instance, if I just played that little clip there, you can hear that that's not what a drummer would. That's not how a drummer would play it. My brother happens to be a drummer, and so I've been around him, playing drums for quite a long time, and I know what an actual drummer does. So that's a slight advantage I have there. But if you don't really know how drummers play and that doesn't really click with your brain, easy way to fix that is to watch drummers play. Go on YouTube, look up your favorite band, look at the drummers, and look how they play. Listen very closely to the dynamics of your favorite record and how those drums are brought together, because humanizing your drum sound is extremely important if you are programming. It is entirely possible in this the time we're living in to program drums and bass and get a very realistic sound, but you do have to put in a little bit more legwork and make sure that they sound natural. So if you are doing drums that are samples that are raw, though, you're going to need to add some space to them. The way I do that is with a virtual room. So I'll let you listen to just the virtual room on the drums. Oops, I should probably just solo this stuff out. All right, so this is Verb Suite Classics, and this is actually just a preset in Verb Suite Classics Fake Drum Room. But the general principles... okay, let's close out of that. General principles of it are, you're going to want to use, obviously, a room setting below a second in delay. I would say probably around here's a sure bet. And then nothing really else. Don't really screw with anything. Just make it a room setting. Experiment with a lot of different reverbs. This isn't the reverb I'll always use. The important thing is that it's just a room setting, and really from there, try out whatever you want. Just the reverb that sounds the best to you. Make sure the decay is not set too high. If you like a reverb that has a super, super duper long decay, a way you can get around that is gate the decay. You just don't want too long of a decay on drums because it's going to all wash over each other and lose that impact, which is what it sounded like it was happening in the mix you sent me. So short decay or gate a long decay. So add a gate after it and cut it off. Next, EQ. Just cutting out all the low end, all the top end. I'll show you like. You can see that sounds super overwhelming. That's all we really need. That's all we're interested in to make the drum sound impactful. And then you mix it underneath the drums. And together they sound... I'll show you the difference, actually. I'll mute this and then bring it in and show you how much of a difference it makes. And yes, that is all you need. Just a little bit. Just a tiny little tail behind it, and then cut it off so that it's not overwhelming the rest of the sound and compromising the integrity of the punch of the close mics. Great. So that's done. Bass. Bass is actually something that was really, really good. So it looks like there's a lot of plugins on here, but I really didn't do that much with it. It just so happens when doing any sort of distortion on bass, you need to spread it across multiple different plugins. So it's not like I'm trying to, do anything special with this bass. I did want to distort it, though. I don't think you needed to. I think it sounded fine the way you sent it to me, but I did want to distort it because you said you had problems with that, and I wanted to try and see if I can help with that. So first thing, it's very important to determine whether your bass is sitting above your kick drum or below your kick drum. This bass is sitting above my kick drum, so I'm going to cut out all the low frequencies that are not above my kick drum. So you can see my kick drum was boosted around 50 hertz or so. So this is just going to be cut all the way up to that. And I'll show you how that works in conjunction. Let me just bypass all of these, actually. Helps them sit much nicer together, and then cut a little bit above that to accentuate that boost. All that's going on here, really simple. Next, Fab Filter Saturn. This is the one exception. I do actually think that you probably need this plugin, and I would highly recommend that you pick it up. Of course, you can get the sound with other distortion plugins in conjunction with splitting up your bass across multiple tracks and all this other stuff. This is not the only way to get the sound, but this is certainly the easiest, and I can't think of a comparable plugin that does exactly this. If you know one, I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments, but this is multi-band saturation. So low end, not touching. Top end, not touching. This thin sliver of mid-range, I'm saturating it like crazy, and I'll show you what that sounds like. Basically, what I'm looking for here is to get above all of the low end. Don't want to distort the low end. That's when you get the flubby sound, and I don't want to distort the top end because that's when it sounds overly harsh. Now, that on its own is too harsh in general. I don't think you should use it. So, following up a distortion, use an impulse response. So this is an impulse response of an Ampeg. Oh, dear Lord. There we go. An Ampeg 810. It was free online. I don't even remember where I got it. Just search Ampeg 810 impulse response. That's where I got it. Important thing here, make sure you have direct checked. If you don't, it will sound bad. Any impulse loader will do. This is the one from Waves, and that really, really helps the sound. So before it, that is the secret to having a distorted bass sound like a bass guitar and not something else. Oh, I know what this is. Generally on, if the bass is sounding like it's not melding with the guitars particularly well, boosting around this area, around 700 to 800 hertz can help. Not a lot, just a little bit. You can see I'm doing 3 dB here. That'll help it meld just a little bit, so that's all that's going on there. And if you can see actually on the frequency spectrum, it's particularly low. Last, rounding it out with some multi-band compression. So this is something I won't always do on bass, but I I did it here because it's what sounded right. Basically, what I'll do is I'll just kind of hit this low end a little bit and then hit the actual pick attack region a little bit so that the neither area gets too out of control. So you can see just kind of leveling it out there. Typically, I mean, if this was a live bass, of course, I would smash it through a compressor. There's no hard rule on slow attack, fast release, or fast attack, slow release. Or I certainly want to do a fast attack, slow release. But sometimes a fast attack and a fast release work really well. Just experiment, really. Really, again, with compression, it's all in the attack and release. So experiment with those. I didn't need to do it here because this bass was programmed and was perfectly played. Oops. Next, moving on to the guitars. Now, there's not a whole lot I could do with these guitars. If I could, I would certainly change the tone out, dial back on the gain, as I said in the section before. But here's what I was sent. Great. And so all that's going on here is just a little bit of EQ. Cutting some lower mid-range and then cutting some nasty frequencies up here that were whistly. Now, a lot of engineers do this all the time. They cut the whistly frequencies out. I would caution you, do not do it unless you particularly hear the frequency. If you cannot hear the frequency, I mean, don't get me wrong, it takes some time to actually hear those frequencies when you don't. So, it takes some time to develop your ear to that point. But if you think you're at that point where you should be able to hear it and you're confident in that, then don't just go cutting for the sake of cutting because you're going to mangle your guitar tone. Only reason I cut here is because I could particularly hear the frequencies and they were bothering me, and so I went searching for which they were. Now, this is a bit of an extreme EQ on a guitar. I typically wouldn't do this, but again, I did not have control over the amp, so this is something that I came out with. Oh, that was played at half speed. I promise that's not how the EQ sounded. Here's how the EQ does sound on the guitars. So cutting some of that boxiness out of there, and it was pretty good. What I would recommend for this, James, is just make sure that you have a good tone going into it. If there's anything that you don't like in the tone, get it out of there at the amp if possible. There are engineers I know who do particular things with the amp and then fix it in EQ later. Like, say, for instance, make the amp sound really thin and then boost a bunch of low end, or make the amp sound really thick with a ton of bass and then cut the low end. Those are all techniques, and these are things that you can experiment with. But a good rule of thumb before you even get to that point is to get the best sound possible and imagine that an EQ does not even exist. For guitars in particular, for distorted guitars. With how much harmonic content is going on there, any sort of extreme EQ on your guitars is likely going to mangle the tone and just make them sound bad. So don't try and do anything extreme on the guitars. Other than that, a little bit of compression or a little bit of limiting is not a bad thing. I generally reach for a limiter just to kiss the top of the guitars in case anything gets over that threshold and keep them in place. But other than that, guitars are actually really simple. After you get the tone that you want and you're happy with the tone, then the guitars are easy. The hardest part is actually getting that tone. The lead, I think this is just the exact same EQ. Yep, I guess I didn't really need to put that here, but the frequencies still apply. And then the clean guitars are the exact same. And that's really it. So I am going to go over some of my processing post, my mastering chain, if you will, although it is not the exact same as actually bouncing this down and mastering it. But this is the general idea of what's going on the track. So the biggest thing here is going to be this drum room and getting your drums EQ'd properly. So all this is a separate bus with sends going to it. And then as you can see, I just have a little bit of less kick going to it. That gives you basically a perfectly tuned room. Make sure you get your compression settings right. Only add stereo space or reverb or anything like that if you think that it requires it. Bass, I think distortion is always a good idea, but the important thing is that you only distort the mid-range of the bass and then follow it up directly with an impulse response. If those two things are not in conjunction, I would not say distorting your bass is a great idea. There are people who add a regular bass track and a distorted bass track and they blend them together. They get great results. I never have. This is what works for me. And so that's what I would say. An impulse response is extremely important when distorting bass. Guitars, I would just say cut back on the gain quite a lot. You don't really need that much. If you're playing hard and you have a good player and everything's working out fine on that end, then you can get away with a very small amount of gain. And then, here I just heard some boxy frequencies in the low mids. Just keep an eye on that. Other than that, let's see. I guess I can go over this. This is not doing anything. snare verb. I don't even think I have that on. Nope. None of these things are doing anything. And typically I'll add a little bit of snare reverb if it needs it. This didn't. This was fine. I had the room sample plus the virtual drum room sufficed. And then obviously I'm not using any of my vocal sends just because I don't need to. There's no vocals. Tom reverb I would turn on normally, but again, the samples are already baked in. So that gets us down here. So this is a Andrew Wade technique, actually, this form of routing. You have an all music, a mix bus, pre-mains 1, and pre-mains 2. If you're just doing this for yourself, then this routing situation doesn't really matter as much. But if you're sending things off to bands, they may want a mastered and unmastered version. They may want instrumentals and all this stuff. So this routing makes a lot of sense then. But basically the way it works is I have everything feeding down to my all music bus besides the effects. The effects go directly to the mix bus. All close tracks, so like all this, oh, well, that needs to go to the drums. That makes more sense. So for instance, all these drums are going to drum, and then that drum is going to all music. These all need to go to all music as well, which they haven't been. So there we go. So actually, now that those are all, let me show you what it sounds like. That sounds better. I was going to say it sounded a little bit unbalanced at first. So those are all going to all music, and that at all music, I have an SSL bus compressor. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm looking for the snare. And what I'm trying to do is I have a slightly slower attack and then the fastest release possible. Still want a fast attack, but essentially what you're doing is you just want your kick and your snare, kick less so than snare, to punch through a little bit. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to duck the rest of the music around it. Now, I will not send vocals to the music bus because I don't want my vocals to duck. I just want the rest of the track to duck. So I'll show you what that's doing. Just drawing attention to those close mic drums, giving them that extra impact. Super important. Very easy to get done. Next on the mix, I can talk. On the mix bus, this is a chain that I set up forever ago. This is not doing anything. This is a trimmer just to get, it's really loud coming into this, just to make sure when I hit my mastering chain, I'm hitting it at the right level. Nothing going on here. Driving it with this 1073 plugin and then boosting a little bit of top end. This is literally doing nothing, completely turned off. This is just here if I need anything. But yeah, that's really it. Adding a little bit of top end, driving it through FGN, and then trimming it. Let's see, another UAD plugin. This is a tape machine. Any tape machine works. I generally use the Slate one, but again, testing out some different Universal Audio plugins, so this one worked. But yeah, that's basically it. These three plugins actually do just a ton for the mix, and they're really simple. So just hit it with a compressor on the music bus, and then add a little bit of saturation and some tape saturation just to give it a little bit more vibe. Next, going into this, I have a little bit of a compressor from Slate. This is like doing a 0.5 decibel of gain reduction. Just if you need it, this is a mastering compressor, really conservative with the attack and release. This is certainly not required. This is just something that if you want to level out some of those transients a little bit more, this can grab and kind of clamp down on some of those transients if they're sticking out too much. Certainly not required. I wouldn't go to it first. Next, super subtle EQ. It's important that if you are using an EQ, you're using a linear phase EQ so that no phase issues pop up. There's some people who say you can just use a normal one. That freaks me out, so I'm not doing it. Really what I'm doing here is the most important thing. This stuff is all dependent on the actual mix, and it's all super subtle, under a decibel for both. This is the only important thing, and I think something that's a lot of people miss out on when they're mastering. I'm cutting at 35 hertz. You probably do not hear the sub frequency down there whenever you're mixing. Even if you have a sub, you're probably not hearing below a certain frequency. However, that information is still there. And while this really doesn't impact the mix, the limiter does hear that information. The limiter does receive that information, meaning that you're not going to be able to get your track as loud as you want to be. And it's going, that bass is going to bring your track into clipping territory. So cutting out all the stuff that no one's really going to hear anyway, it's just really good when you hit your final limiter that not all the information is being sent to it. So cutting it super steep here too, because I don't want any of this. I'm not concerned about it sounding natural. I don't want any of it. This stuff really just subtle. If you hear anything, keep it under a decibel. You should be good. Use a super wide Q so it sounds natural. You will be on your way. Next, even more saturation. Man, I'm just burping like crazy. I'm so sorry. Even more saturation. So this is Isotope Ozone 6. This is the exciter. I'll show you what it does for the mix, because I think this one's enough to really warrant it. Just ties everything together in the mid-range. I love this I guess harmonic exciter, distortion, whatever. Using a lot of, building up these different distorted layers that are subtly distorted does a lot for metal. And so experiment with different plugins. I think that's really, really a big part of metal and recording music in general is that saturation, especially when you're in digital realm. Max bass is next. This is just a harmonic exciter for the low end of a track. I don't always use it. I actually tend to mix pretty bass heavy, and I think this plugin's a big part of it. This is not essential, just exciting those subharmonics to make the low end sound bigger, especially with this cut. Next, this is basically what I do for mastering as far as limiting goes. I set up a limiter, a pretty conservative limiter. I set up a final limiter, which is basically doing nothing besides preventing clipping. And then between those two, I have a clipper. A clipper is basically modeling what mastering engineers still do, but primarily used to do, which is clip old converters. So what they would do is they'd turn up their track way high when they were sending it out of the converters, and it would clip the converters. And these old analog, these things sounded really good, and they're super duper expensive and whatever, but plugins now that allow you to clip are available. So I use Event Horizon. There are a few others out there, but this is the one that works for me. And so essentially combining all these three things allow you to get a loud mix without it sounding too limited or too crazy. Whenever you're doing it, shoot for an RMS of around -8. That's what you're going for. That's commercial level. Other than that, that's it. So overall, very good work, James. I think that you're certainly doing a good job, and I think that moving forward, you'll have, you won't have too much problems. I'm assuming this is your own music, but if you do anything for any other bands, the important thing is that you just get your samples picked correctly, get the compression settings good, and add from there. Tune back on the gain on guitars, and yeah, really just nitpicks. They're very small things, and they may seem insignificant, but really adding all those things up, that's what changed this mix over to what it is. Balance issues, I don't think there was any balance issues in your mix, so I'm not really commenting on that too much. I think you have a good direction there. It's really just the small few things I mentioned. So overall, very good work. If you have a track that you'd like me to critique, make sure you use the form in the box below to send me a message, or you can send me an email directly, and I will be sure to get back to you. I also offer mixing services, mastering services, all that stuff. So that's all available. If you want some samples to try out and you don't want to spend too much money, I do sell a sample pack in the description below. It's not the best sample pack by any means, and I would highly recommend that you buy others and experiment with my sample pack and their sample packs in conjunction and try and find new sounds. But I do think it is a very good starting point for samples, and I think that it is a good teaching tool to have those samples available to kind of see what you can do with crafting a very stock sound. So the samples are completely unprocessed, and they allow you to actually work on your processing. Other than that, I think that's all good. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing. If you've stayed till the end of this video, I really appreciate it. James, once again, thank you for reaching out to me. And yeah, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.